It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Fraser Cameron. He is head of the political section in the delegation of the European Commission in Washington, D.C. From 1975 to '89, he was a member of the British Diplomatic Service, serving in such venues as New York, Bonn, and East Berlin. Since joining the European Commission in 1990, Dr. Cameron has been closely involved in the external relations of the Union, specializing in transatlantic relations and European security issues. He is the author of a number of books and articles on European affairs, most recently, The Foreign and Security Policy of the European Union, Past, Present, and Future. Dr. Cameron.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The three introductory remarks. Firstly, the European Union has a large experience of dealing with terrorism over the last 20 years. I just mentioned the ETA in the Basque, the IRA in Northern Ireland, P2 in Italy are just some examples. Secondly, the competence for dealing with terrorism is still largely in the hands of individual member states, but there is a growing role for the European Union as such, particularly in the light of decisions that were taken following the Treaty of Amsterdam and the recent European Council at Tampere. This was followed up, for example, by the visit of the commissioner responsible for this area, Commissioner Vitorino, here in Washington a couple of weeks ago, where he met Janet Reno, he met General McCaffrey, the drug czar, and so on. So this is a growing area where the European Union is becoming involved. And thirdly, it's a growing area too of transatlantic cooperation. It's very close relationships have developed, particularly in the last 2 or 3 years, between the EU and the US in dealing with terrorism. So how does the EU actually approach international terrorism? Well, firstly, we take the view that you have to build as wide a consensus as possible in dealing with terrorism, and that means you have to get the United Nations on board. So we actually invest quite a lot of time and effort in trying to ensure that as many states sign up for the various conventions dealing with international terrorism in the UN. It was a French draft, for example, that led to the UN Convention on the Financing of International Terrorism. We favor the idea that's been proposed for a special General Assembly meeting to discuss international terrorism. We think the draft on the table, for example, by India is a good basis to take work forward. So the first point is we must try and ensure that the international organizations play a role, particularly the UN, but other organizations like the G8 have an important role to play as well. Secondly, we believe that you must ensure, and this is, I think, the point you made yourself, Mr. Chairman, that you do not fight terrorism by damaging your own human rights. You also must make a clear distinction between acts of terrorism which are attributable to states and those to individuals, so as you do not confer any status on individuals under international law. This is an important point. It's really only states that you can actually charge in terms with illegal action. Now, inside the European Union, all the member states have ratified all the various anti-terrorist conventions. The most important one, I think, is in the financing of terrorism. All of our member states have pretty strong money laundering acts. I can tell you from personal experience, when my daughter, who was living in Germany, tried to open a bank account in Britain last year, she had to go through an amazing number of bureaucratic hoops simply to open a bank account. It's becoming much more difficult to hide funds in the European Union. Secondly, I mentioned Europol earlier on. Europol is not a European FBI. It may someday develop into a European FBI, but it's still very much at its initial phase. But it has a mandate, which is quite important, to exchange information between the member states on counterterrorism, to keep a database on terrorism, to assume responsibility for liaison in many fields with third countries and actually compiling a whole glossary of terrorism. So Europol is beginning to play an important role in this area. In this connection, it's important to know that we have a system called Schengen now, which means we have one external border for the European Union. This is beginning to affect Americans who will travel around Europe. And the point is, it's a very sophisticated computer storage of information of individuals connected with terrorism, and many have already been arrested at EU borders. In terms of our relations with outside countries, I'll come to the United States in a second, but let me just give you one example where we're doing something very concrete, and that's trying to help Palestine, particularly the Palestine authorities, build up a whole series of counter-terrorist measures. So we're spending a lot of money training them in terms of management, communications, explosive ordnance disposal, IT, specialist search, surveillance techniques, and so on. And this is actually bearing results. So the EU is actually cooperating with a number of countries. Another example, of course, is dealing with drugs. This is a close link between terrorism and drugs. And so we have been working, and this brings me on to the United States connection, with the US in Bolivia, Colombia, Nigeria, and in the money laundering project on the Caribbean. And it's with the United States that we have the, I think, closest dialogue now. We meet under the framework of the new transatlantic agenda, which is summits and various high-level official meetings and working group meetings, and there's regular meetings on terrorism. And it was on the agenda just last Friday when President Clinton met with EU leaders, Mr. Prodi and Mr. Lippinen. And of course, one of the main questions on the agenda there was how to deal with rogue states which have some connection with terrorism, like Iran, like Libya, like North Korea. And let me be quite frank, we do have certain differences of approach. We have maintained what we call a critical dialogue with Iran. We think that it's more important to try and engage with the moderate leadership in Tehran to try and influence their behavior rather than simply isolate the country. And we believe that that strategy has actually had some impact. We believe it's important to engage in North Korea, to try and offer them some carrots to stop their missile testing, for example. And we believe that the combination of carrot and stick in dealing with Libya has also brought considerable results so far. So we need to maintain the dialogue. We really need to ask ourselves these key questions: how you actually deal with terrorism. Obviously, as other speakers have said, you need greater and better intelligence. Secondly, you need more international cooperation. But thirdly, you have to tackle the roots of terrorism. You have to look at why terrorist groups are formed and where they breed. And they breed generally in areas of severe economic and social discontent. And therefore, your strategy has to involve some outreach to tackle these problems. For example, in Central Asia, the European Union is trying to tackle the massive problems in the Fergana Valley, trying to improve the environment, trying to provide finance for economic development so that these groups that we hear are moving towards some support for Islamic fundamentalism are actually undercut. So it's a triple-pronged strategy. It's an area where the EU is getting more and more involved, and it's an area, I think, of growing transatlantic cooperation. Thank you very much.